Are you comfortable with celebrity? Because when I
Not
mentioned
really,
your fan
no.
base,
Not even the term. I'm crap at it. I kind of go, well, I'm kind of an actor.
well, how do you have such a huge fan base? I mean, it's Cumberbitches, whatever they call them,
Sure.
all these terms.
Yep.
There's on Tumblr, there's a
Yep.
whole thing devoted to
So
this.
someone's shaking their head as... Guess this is it.
What's it, Phil?
What's it? All right, Fatso, I'll tell you what it is. 25 years since our first run together. 1900 and nothing.
That's a long time.
Not too damn long. Know what we should do?
What's that?
Go camping again in the mountains and shoot ourselves some fresh elk liver. Cook it right there on the coals, like Bronco Henry taught us. You got a sore gut?
No.
You act like it pains you to hitch two words together.
A movie I loved, by the way, that came out, it's eligible this year, it came out in March or something, The Courier, which was a fantastically interesting role, I thought, and story, too.
Thank you, yeah, we're very proud to have produced that one as well. And at the heart of it is this story of an everyman doing an extraordinary thing in the midst of the Cold War. It's sort of salesman becoming a courier for the most sensitive information that was gleaned from the Russians, the highest ranking Soviet turned informant called Colonel Penkovsky. So, yeah, an amazing story to unearth. Known to my parents' generation, but relatively unknown to the rest of us.
Do you like playing, I mean, you have played so many, I just wrote down a few of them, but, you know, from Thomas Edison to Alan Turing to Grenville Wynne, Louis Wain, Stephen Hawking, on and on and on. You have played
quite a few real people, yeah.
Yeah, a real, is that a challenge in a different way than...
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. I was talking to Kirsten, funny enough, about this last night. Kirsten Dunst, who's in The Power of the Dog, and she was saying, I mean, yeah, why do people play real people all the time? I mean, you know, I was sitting there going, oh, it's a bit embarrassing, I play quite a few real people, and she was kind of attacking the idea of it being, you know, it's an ego-driven thing, and there is something of that. It's like, that person is extraordinary, or that story is unknown. There's also that, you know, I mean, a lot of the people I've been who are known aren't necessarily known for the story as we tell it, you know. Yeah. I think full exposure of Alan Turing's suffering wasn't prevalent enough in our history until perhaps that film, and then it was much more talked about with some amazing results. The exoneration finally of gay men who were prosecuted in that time, not just him, but everyone, and that pardon, late as it was still
that movie made a difference. The Imitation Game made a huge difference.
I don't know. I used to say, well, I don't understand why this guy who's achieved so much and suffered so much, why he isn't being, you know, honoured, why he's not on a banknote, and now he is on the £50 note, you know. So there's that part of it, even though he's a well-known figure to an extent, and the same, very much the same with Grenville Wynne, I think. And a lot of these things are about looking behind closed doors. So, for example, with the relatively unknown Cummings, the Boris Johnson's now ex-advisor, who was at the forefront of the Brexit campaign, Dominic Cummings, you know, there wasn't much known about him at the time outside of the corridors of power at Whitehall, and James Graham has that amazing ability, in the phrase of Hamilton, the writer, that is, like Hamilton sings about being in the room where it happens, and to the point that people are really suspicious of, were you actually in the room where it happens? Did you have a bug in that room? Yeah. So there's a kind of freedom that comes with that as well. It's exposing truths that haven't been aired before.
Louis Wain was someone I had no idea who he was. Yeah. And what a complicated man to play as well. Yeah,
and a gorgeous human being, someone who found his place in the world very difficult to endure at times, but endure he did to a ripe old age. And it is a story of love triumphing over all and sustaining him. But he suffered huge bouts of mental health deterioration, I think brought on partly societally, but also through his makeup, how he was. His sister also was incarcerated and died whilst in an asylum. And he ended up in a pauper's asylum at the end of his life, only to be rescued by people who realised he was Louis Wain. So he was even forgotten within his own life. And I think now, I heard about him through this script, this wonderful script by Simon Stevens, and it was pitched to me by Shoebox, Ed, and Guy from there just, came to Adam and I, who run Sunny March, my production company, and pitched this idea and this story. And I was just really taken with this human being who'd been through so much, whose paintings I then looked at and went, oh yeah, I kind of recognise those anthropomorphic cat drawings. They're somewhere from my childhood, but we're not taught about him at school. It's not like an English thing. It was a real discovery working on that film.
Yeah, and people notice when they see this. I showed it for my screening series, and his work with cats and all of that stuff.
Yeah, historically he's known for that and for domesticating the animal by popularizing so much in this sort of anthropomorphic form. But it all came out of a human story, and that's what Will Sharp, who took over the writing and the direction of it in such a superlative way. I feel he's an amazing talent for us to be working with as a young company, and him as a director at the beginning of his career. It deals with depression, but it also deals with infidelity or frustration within relationships, but also with love and a keenness and a sensitivity, which is really beautiful and very, very funny at times. Yeah. Perfect for Louis' world, which was often slipping between reality and how he perceived it and what was actually happening in his imagination.
And a lot of cats.
And a lot of cats.
Never work with cats, because that were a lot of cats on that set at one time.
Ever. I mean, kittens are fine. They play with balls of string and lick from saucers of milk. They're good. They do what kittens should do. Anything older than a kitten and you're utterly screwed for your day. Because, it's like, where do you want the cat? Oh, just somewhere, just in the background, just a couple of cats. Where's it going to? Well, all right, just maybe over there. Well, what journey do you want it to make? Okay, maybe. And then you realise it's because they have to trail food, they have to get the clicker out, they have to prod it. There's cats up. Everyone, cats are coming on set. You have to be quiet and respectful. They get rewards all the time. I'm sitting there as an actor going, where are we in this? Why don't we call our unions and say that there's an animal that's being treated better than us? And also with very poor results. This cat just kind of goes and walks in the opposite direction. They don't give a shit. It was really hard, but actually it was a very good decision. And like all of Will's, it was based on trying to bring a reality that was Louis' world into the telling of the story, whether it was turning up the colour, the voluminous sort of poppiness of some of the creations, the facial hair, the costumes that were in his work. And, he didn't want to use anything other than real cats. He didn't want to have animation take over. It would have been a very different flavour. And he wanted that analogue feel.
Well, from cats to cattle. And horses and other things. I mean, you're definitely working with creatures.
Cats
now.
to dogs. Lots of creatures.
And dogs, yeah. And
I mean, in all honesty, they do keep you alive. We're going back to cats for a second. It keeps you alive, and so do cattle, and so do horses, and so do dogs, and everything else that appeared in Jane's film.
Of course, I'm talking about Power of the Dog. Jane Campion's. I think it's her first in over a decade feature film.
Yeah, it is.
Talk about complex. You're playing and used to playing very kind of complex characters. Yeah. This may be one of the most complex I've seen. He's kind of everything. I mean, people can look on the surface and see he's not a nice guy. Yeah. But there's a lot of reasons why and going through, and it was interesting to see the dimensions that you were able to bring to Phil.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, that's, I see him as a tragic figure. He's ultimately very flawed and very unhappy. He's unable to live an authentic life where he's capable of loving and being loved, and that's a tragedy. That's a lost life, and what spills out into the world through the kind of resultant behaviour of the fear and the isolation and the loneliness and the jealousy and the bitterness of that is so destructive to the people around him and to himself. Like you said, I think the masculinity is real, but I think where it becomes toxic is all to do with the repression of his true nature. And
he's homophobic, he's homosexual, he's all kinds of things. And it's revealed in ever slow doses here.
Absolutely,
in this film.
Absolutely. And I think that's the gift of Jane's boldness as a storyteller, as you're asked to be with him at his most abhorrent before you really understand what it is that's motivating him. There are little chinks in his armor near the beginning. He sees his brother at the beginning of the story not wanting to celebrate a 25-year joint history of running a ranch and celebrating a man that taught them everything they needed to know to be successful, and they are really successful. at doing that. Bronco Henry, this huge off-screen character who's very much part
Right.
of both of their past, but
Yeah.
very specifically a love in Phil's life. And I feel, even at that moment, Jane lingers on Phil in the guest house looking for George, and then waking up to see him standing at the foot of the bed. And it's him being cut adrift, it's him being left alone, it's him finally being isolated from this very peculiar but codependent relationship he has with his brother, who's constantly body shaming and teasing and cajoling and kind of slap across the face. You know, he wants some, but I think he's always been lonely with George. George isn't a match for him. Doesn't have the intellect, doesn't have the wit, doesn't have the speed, doesn't have the curiosity. And I think that's hard. That's alienating. So all he's got left is a punching bag, you know.
Yeah.
And then when that goes, it's peculiarly destabilizing for him. And then he sees the love that's dragging him into a different world, and just it all kicks off. He can't stand it. He can't see anything generously. It's all about, you're taking something away from me that I've worked for. You're taking away my brother that I love, and I love hating. And now you're loving him, so I can't hate him. And you're doing it with this half child, this affront to my masculinity, this effete boy Peter as the heir to all my work. And it's just like the perfect storm. And that's what's so brilliant about Savage's novel, and Jane's script and the pacing of her adaptation.
Did you use the novel at all when you were playing him, or did you go by the script?
No, hugely. Unlike Rose and many of the other characters actually, but many Rose I think is all in Jane, is much more amplified in Jane's script, but and certain aspects of Phil certainly are as well. That's why Jane's such a perfect director for treating this revisionist view of masculinity in the Western milieu. And you know, the book, as we both wanted to honour, is the most spectacular blueprint for drawing a character for Phil. There are fantastic flashbacks and all the other sort of building of the mile-long iceberg below the superficial surface behaviour that, you know, is so key to characterization when you're playing someone this complex and layered.
It's a fascinating period to play a cowboy. Or
yeah, well, it is
West.
anyway. I mean, you know, and he set this basically around a true story, around his family, Thomas Savage, the author of the book, and that time was a very transitional time, you know. And
1925.
Mechanization was starting to come in. The automobile was becoming much more widely used. There were changes in land laws and the use of land and permits, and the farmers that had sort of used tiny patches of land, the European frontier settlers, had all failed and moved on to something else, and or moved back to the city that was starting to become, you know, great sort of capitalist centers of the now. And farm and ranch world work was changing, and it wasn't about men and guns and saloons. It was becoming something far more refined and difficult and different. And Phil's holding on to that past. George is going to the future, and the future is peace. I mean, there's this complete time with the era between that dynamic of the characters.
I just heard this, but you didn't take a shower for a week.
There is that, yeah. There's a sort of hot topic at the moment. People always pick up on that. There's a lot of wash talk amongst acting right now. I don't know why, but this was purely for the sake of the role. This guy revels in the fact that he's covered in the fruits of his labour, mud and shit and blood, and it's all there, and sweat, his smell. He, you know, he's an animal. He's, despite his amazing intellect, his psychological power, and how he's abusive with that power, which is another thing. But yeah, he's very adept, but he's also refined. He can do extraordinarily delicate things with these rough hands covered in all that, the miasma of his world and his work. Whittle a chair the size of, you know, thumb and perfectly. And do bigger work with ironmongery and taxidermy, all sorts of things which aren't in the film, which I also learned to do or engage with. And so he contains that dexterity and that delicateness in amongst all that dirt and that sort of callousness and that weatheredness. Again, another kind of contradiction of him. And yet he's respected. He's respected as much for the fact that he can whittle a little miniature bit of furniture as steer a whole head of cattle into town to market and be a master horseman. But all those things, I went to Montana and I just immersed myself in the landscape and the sensuality of it, to just absorb it as a physical body, to feel that growing into how I held myself and my posture.
That Montana-specific accent, too.
It's very unspecific, because actually it's of that era as well. It's very hard to find a recording. It's very hard to be very, very Montana specific. It really moves around depending on what border you're touching on in that state, as I found out with my work with Joy Ellison, who's a real master dialect coach. She's just wonderful. And she she said, look, you know, in the book there's some things we could experiment with the Bostonian sort of open flat vowel, and it literally says in the book, you know, Phil never just said forest, he said forest. You know, it sort of spells it with an A, and he never said George, he said George, so Georgie boy instead of Georgie boy, you know. And saying riding rather than riding, you know, not going too Western, not going too South or Texan. And holding on to some weird sort of, some element of refined dialogue, but also then becoming completely inarticulate with rage at a point, going, whatchamacallit, alcoholic, and that's in the book, it's lifted from the book into the script. I've never done anything for likability. I'm not interested in who's the hero, who's the villain, who's likable. Sometimes at Q&As, it's like, you're horrible, you're great, you're the hero. And I'm like, do you want to paint us just in, am I blue as well, you know? Do you want to just, am I so boxed in, limited by just that? I'm interested in the grey, actually. Yeah. I'm interested in what happens when the colours get really messy and you realise that all of us are constructed of so many different things. And the rich gift of Jane's camera through Ari's lens and through her adaptation means that I get to play a character with a secret and then reveal that secret as well. Right. In a very private moment, which is not really the same in the book. You know, it's touched upon, but it's not quite, it's not there. There isn't a connection to his past in the way there is in this film. And that's wonderful. That's wonderful to be able to straddle both the public and the private of this character.